Cast into the mud, a farmer saw his life crumble when a storm destroyed everything he owned. Sleeping under the stars, with tears of despair, he questioned his fate. When all seemed lost, an opportunity arose, beginning a journey of transformation. From the depths of suffering to the glory of rebuilding, this story will show how God turns mud into gold. Prepare for an emotional journey of faith that will touch your heart. Subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. On the muddy bank of the Mississippi River, a man knelt, contemplating the devastation. Tears streamed down his sun-weathered face, mixing with the mud that was once his prosperous field. The sky, once his ally, had turned into his tormentor. John, with his calloused hands that for so many years had caressed the earth like a lover's, face now clutched handfuls of muck, watching not just the soil, but his dreams and hopes slip through his fingers. The storm the night before had roared like a fierce animal, devouring years of work in a matter of hours. It wasn't just any storm, but one of those that the old stories called the furious breath of God. The river, normally gentle and generous, had risen like a wall of water, invading everything in its path. The stone and mud house that John had built with his own hands, where every stone told a story and every beam narrated a sacrifice, was now nothing but soaked ruins. "Why, my God, why did you choose me for this trial?" His words were swallowed by the wind that still blew, as if even the right to lament was denied him. John had inherited that land from his father, who had received it from his grandfather, in a lineage that stretched back to times that only the century-old oak trees could witness. Each generation had added something: an orchard, an irrigation system, farming techniques. It was more than land. It was a living legacy, a testament to perseverance written with sweat and determination. Now, that legacy lay submerged, like a forgotten dream upon waking. The wheat crop, which just a week before had rippled golden under the sun, promising a bountiful harvest, was now flattened in the mud, the heads swollen and rotting. The few animals that survived wandered confused, their eyes revealing a primal fear that echoed John's own helplessness. The barn had completely collapsed, crushing inside it the grain reserves that would have ensured survival through the winter. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape, John felt the weight of the first night without a roof over his head. Gathering the few belongings he managed to save, a soaked blanket, a small canteen of water, a bag of dried fruit that had miraculously remained high on a shelf, he improvised a precarious shelter under what was left of a twisted fig tree. Lying on the damp earth, counting the stars that appeared in the sky like silver tears, John allowed despair to envelop him like a cold shroud. His exhausted body trembled, not just from the night's chill, but from the sobs that shook his chest. He was a man reduced to his most primitive essence, stripped of everything except his pain and his unanswered questions. 7 days and 7 nights passed like this. 7 dawns that brought no hope, 7 sunsets that only deepened his despair. John wandered the property like a ghost, rummaging through rubble aimlessly, sometimes shouting at the sky, other times kneeling in silence, his empty gaze fixed on the horizon. The nearest neighbors, also affected by the flood, though to a lesser extent, offered help, but he refused with a silent gesture. How could he accept charity when he had always been the provider? How could he look into the eyes of those he had so often helped and now see pity in their gaze? On the 8th morning, when the sun was still just a promise on the horizon, John woke up startled by the distant sound of bells, small bronze bells that adorned the harnesses of horses and mules. Pushing himself up onto his elbows, he saw in the distance a wagon train slowly approaching along the road that bordered the river. It was an unusual sight for that time of year, when trade routes normally veered north, avoiding the scorching heat of the valley. The wagon train approached until it was just a few yards from where his property began, or what was left of it. At the head of the group, riding a particularly imposing horse, came a middle-aged man, his tanned skin weathered by countless journeys under the sun. His black beard with streaks of silver framed a face marked by deep wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, wrinkles of someone who had often smiled in the face of adversity. "Did the waters take everything from you too, friend?" asked the Aizure. leader of the wagon train, in a voice that sounded like sand moving over stone. There was compassion in his words, but not pity, a distinction that did not escape John. "Everything I built in 30 years of life," John replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Every seed planted, every stone laid. Everything is just mud now." The merchant nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the surrounding desolation. For a moment, he seemed lost in distant thoughts, perhaps remembering his own losses, perhaps calculating the value of what he saw before him. Finally, he spoke. "My name is Ezekiel, a merchant of seeds and spices. We are traveling to Chicago, where I have buyers waiting. I need strong men to help with the animals and the cargo." He paused, studying John intently. "I offer you work until we get there. Food, water, a place to sleep, and a few coins when we part ways. It's not charity, it's a fair exchange of labor for sustenance." John felt a flicker of dignity light up in his chest. It wasn't charity, it was work. A way to get away from that constant sight of ruins. An opportunity to earn enough to perhaps one day start over. "Why me?" he asked, suspicious of the sudden change in his fortune. "There are many men in the nearby villages who would be more useful than a farmer who has lost even his own land." Ezekiel smiled, revealing surprisingly white teeth. "Your calluses speak of hard work. Your eyes, despite the pain, show character, and," he gestured to the surroundings, "men who have lost everything tend to value every small opportunity. Besides," he added with a glint in his eyes, "I believe it wasn't by chance that we crossed your path exactly today." John hesitated. Leaving that land, even devastated, felt like a betrayal of the generations who had cultivated it before him. On the other hand, staying meant slowly wasting away, consumed by misery and hunger. "How long until Chicago?" he finally asked. 3 months if the road gods are favorable," Ezekiel replied. "Perhaps more if we encounter sandstorms or bandits. Life in the desert is unpredictable, as you well know. 3 months. Enough time for the land to begin to dry, for the most painful memories to subside, to earn some money and perhaps, just perhaps, find a new perspective." John looked one last time at the remains of his house, at the ruined field, at the trees twisted by the fury of the waters. Then, turning to Ezekiel, he nodded silently. That same afternoon, with the midday sun turning the puddles of mud into blinding mirrors, John tied up his bundle of few belongings, the blanket now dry, a small flint knife that had belonged to his father, a leather canteen, and a small bag of seeds he had managed to recover from the destroyed barn. Common seeds, nothing special, but a tangible fragment of what his life had been. As he helped organize the wagon train for departure, John noticed something peculiar. Among the various loads, there were small chests of ornate wood, sealed with red wax and protected by armed guards who never strayed from them. His curiosity must have been evident on his face, for Ezekiel approached, speaking in a low voice. "They are rare seeds, my friend, more valuable than gold to those who know their true worth. They grow where others wouldn't survive, bear fruit when all around is just desolation." John felt a shiver run down his spine. Seeds that survive in desolation. There was something in those words that echoed within him, as if they spoke not just of plants, but of something deeper, more personal. The wagon train departed as the first shadows of afternoon began to lengthen. John didn't look back, not out of indifference, but because he couldn't bear to see his life disappearing into the distance. Instead, he fixed his eyes on the path ahead, on the dust raised by the animals' hooves, on the rhythmic sway of the loads. The rhythm of the wagon train soon imposed itself as a new reality, waking before dawn, walking until the sun was too high, resting during the hottest hours, resuming the journey until dusk, setting up camp, tending to the animals, eating sparingly, sleeping under the stars, and starting it all again the next day. Days turned into weeks, and the weeks accumulated. The landscape gradually changed. The moist fields of the river valley gave way to arid hills, which in turn gave way to dry plains and, finally, to the true desert, with its dunes that changed shape with the wind. John adapted to the nomadic life with an ease that surprised himself. His body, already accustomed to the hard work of farming, quickly learned the rhythms and demands of the wagon train. Ezekiel proved to be a fair leader, though strict. At night, around the campfires, he shared stories of distant lands, exotic peoples, and lessons learned in decades of trade. John listened eagerly, absorbing not just the stories but the wisdom embedded within them. Slowly, a cautious friendship began to develop between the experienced merchant and the displaced farmer. 90 days after leaving the banks of the Mississippi, the wagon train arrived at a small village nestled between two dry hills. Unlike the other settlements they had passed through, this one seemed particularly affected by water scarcity. The few inhabitants who came out to observe the travelers' arrival had suspicious looks and faces marked by deprivation. Children with bellies swollen from malnutrition peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, their eyes too large on faces too small. Ezekiel ordered them to set up camp on the outskirts of the village. "We won't stay here long," he explained to his men. "There's no trade to be done where there is nothing to offer in return." That night, as the wagon train prepared to sleep, John remained awake, thoughtful. The images of the village haunted his thoughts, especially an old woman he had seen carrying an empty jug back from the dry well, her body bent not just by the weight of years, but by the burden of frustrated hope. Something in that image stirred an old memory in John, his grandfather, showing him how to find underground water using nothing but a forked branch from a willow. "Water always finds its way to the surface," the old man would say. "You just need to know how to listen for its call." Unable to sleep, John quietly got up and walked to the edge of the village. The full moon bathed the landscape in a silvery light, revealing details that the scorching sun hid during the day. With eyes trained by generations of farmers, John observed the terrain, noticing small differences in the sparse vegetation, the pattern of the rocks, the slight depression in the soil that could indicate an ancient riverbed. At dawn, having not slept, John sought out Ezekiel. The merchant listened with skepticism as John explained his theory. There was water under the village, not very deep, but the inhabitants didn't know where to dig. And you, a stranger who arrived yesterday, believe you know better than them, who have lived here for generations? Ezekiel questioned, one eyebrow raised in disbelief. "Sometimes we need new eyes to see what has always been in front of us," John replied with a conviction that surprised them both. "Give me 3 men, tools, to dig, and if I am wrong, I will work double for the rest of the journey to make up for the lost time." Ezekiel studied John's face for a long moment, as if trying to decipher a text in an unknown language. Finally, he nodded curtly. "You have until noon. After that, we leave, with or without water." Accompanied by 3 reluctant men from the wagon train, John returned to the spot he had identified the night before. Using the Y-shaped branch of a willow, he began walking slowly in ever-widening circles, holding the branch out in front of him with his palms facing up. The villagers, initially suspicious, began to gather to observe the strange ritual. There were laughs and skeptical comments, but John remained focused, ignoring the distractions. Suddenly, the branch seemed to come alive, twisting violently downwards, almost escaping his hands. John smiled. This was how his grandfather had described the feeling. "Here," he said simply, marking the spot with a stone. "Dig here." Work began immediately. The soil was hard but not impossible to penetrate. As the hole deepened, the villagers drew closer, the initial disbelief giving way to cautious hope. By noon, when the sun was directly overhead and Ezekiel approached to end the experiment, the excavation had reached almost 2 meters deep. John, covered in dust and sweat, worked tirelessly, taking turns with the other men. "That's enough, John," Ezekiel called out. "You kept your word. It's time to go." At that exact moment, the man at the bottom of the pit let out a shout. John jumped into the excavation, sinking up to his ankles in cold, damp mud. He touched the soil with trembling hands, feeling the moisture. It wasn't just moisture, it was water rising, soaking the earth, turning it into an increasingly liquid paste. "Deeper!" John shouted, renewed energy in his voice. Just a little more. An hour later, when the excavation reached a depth where the men had to be pulled up by ropes, the first drop of crystal-clear water seeped from the soil, followed by another, and another, until a constant flow formed. The villagers, who had been silent until then, erupted in shouts of joy and tears. Women ran to fetch empty jugs, children danced in the mud, men shouted blessings upon the strangers. Ezekiel, observing the scene with his arms crossed over his chest, had an enigmatic smile on his lips. When John finally emerged from the well, soaked and exhausted, but with a look of accomplishment in his eyes, the merchant placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Perhaps there is more to you than just a landless farmer, my friend," he said in a low voice so only John could hear. "Perhaps your journey has a greater purpose than we imagined." The villagers insisted that the wagon train stay. An impromptu celebration followed, with the little they had to share. Simple bread, olives, a little goat cheese, and for the first time in a long time, fresh, abundant water. During the feast, John was treated as a hero, receiving blessings and thanks from everyone. An old woman, the same one he had seen carrying the empty jug, held his hands in hers, her eyes clouded by cataracts gazing at his face. "You brought life back to our village," she said in a trembling voice. "May life also return to you, son of the desert." That night, while the others slept, John sat by the edge of the newly dug well, watching the stars reflected on the surface of the water that continued to rise. Something had changed within him. A spark had ignited where before there were only cold ashes of despair. That water seeping from the seemingly barren ground was like a metaphor for his own situation. Perhaps, beneath the desolate surface of his current life, there were possibilities he couldn't yet see. 3 days later, when the wagon train finally departed, the villagers formed 2 lines to see them pass, offering small gifts as thanks. A handful of dried fruit, amulets for protection, a bottle of valuable oil. More importantly, however, was the gift that the village elder gave John, a rolled parchment containing drawings and instructions for an ancestral irrigation system developed by their ancestors to maximize water use in arid lands. "This knowledge has been passed down in our family for generations," the old man explained. "Now we pass it to you, so that the water you found is never wasted." John received the parchment with reverence, understanding the value of what was entrusted to him. It wasn't just a method of irrigation, it was wisdom distilled through centuries of struggle against aridity, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of adversity. As they moved away from the village, now transformed by the presence of water, John noticed something subtle but unmistakable. His heart, which for so long had been as dry as the desert around him, was beginning to harbor a feeling he almost didn't recognize anymore: hope. Journey continued for weeks, crossing increasingly severe landscapes. The heat became more relentless each day. The air so dry that breathing was like inhaling fire. The animals of the wagon train began to show signs of exhaustion, their steps becoming slower, their eyes losing their sparkle. Ezekiel himself, normally unshakable, showed concern as he consulted old maps at night, tracing alternative routes with a wrinkled finger. "The desert has changed since I last passed through here," he confided to John one night. "Where there was once an oasis, now there is only sand. Where there was a safe path, now there are territories disputed by hostile tribes." 6 months after the journey began, when they should have been reaching the outskirts of Chicago, the IA wagon train faced its most severe trial. A sandstorm appeared on the horizon like a yellow wall advancing upon them. There wasn't enough time to seek shelter. In minutes, they were swallowed by the furious whirlwind. John had never experienced anything so terrifying. The sand penetrated everywhere: eyes, nose, mouth, clothes, making it impossible to see more than a few inches ahead. The roar of the wind drowned out any attempt at communication. The wagon train was forced to stop, the horses kneeling with heads down, the people huddled around the loads, covering their faces with soaked cloths, to be able to breathe. The storm lasted an entire night, a night that seemed endless. When dawn finally broke and the wind subsided, revealing a sky of an almost painfully intense blue. The wagon train was partially buried. Men and animals slowly emerged from the sand like creatures born from the earth itself. It was then that the devastating discovery was made. During the chaos of the storm, one of the chests containing the precious seeds had been damaged. The broken lid had allowed sand to enter, mixing with the seeds. And worse, some of them had been carried away by the wind and scattered across the desert. Ezekiel, upon seeing the damage, was transformed. His face, normally controlled, contorted into a mask of fury. With a roar that seemed to come from the depths of his being, he grabbed John by the collar. "It was your responsibility. You should have protected the cargo," he bellowed, drops of saliva hitting John's face. "Do you know how much was lost? More than you would earn in 10 lifetimes of work." John didn't try to defend himself. It was true that he was assigned to that section of the wagon train during the storm, although no one could truly be blamed for the chaos caused by nature. What surprised him wasn't the accusation, but the transformation in Ezekiel. The wise and just man now revealed himself, capable of blind, irrational rage when his interests were threatened. With a final shove that sent John staggering backward, Ezekiel pronounced his sentence, "You are expelled. Take your bundle and your canteen and go. Consider yourself fortunate that I am not demanding payment for what was lost." The other members of the wagon train watched in silence, no one daring to intercede. In minutes, John found himself alone in the desert, with only a small portion of water, some dried fruit, and the clothes on his back. The wagon train moved away quickly, becoming first a dark stain, and then nothing more than a speck on the horizon, until it disappeared completely. For the first time since the journey began, John felt the true weight of solitude. Not just the physical solitude of being abandoned in the desert, but the spiritual solitude of a man who had lost everything, twice. First his land, and now the fragile network of relationships and purpose he had built in recent months. Standing motionless, under the merciless sun, John allowed himself a moment of absolute despair. Scarce tears streamed down his face, evaporating almost before they reached his chin. There was a certain absurdity in his situation. So complete was his misfortune that it bordered on the comical. A bitter laugh escaped his cracked lips. "Is this it then? Is this the great divine plan for my life? Lose everything, gain a spark of hope, only to have it crushed again?" There was no answer except the whisper of the wind over the dunes. John looked around, trying to orient himself. Without a compass or map, his only reference was the sun, and even this, at high noon, offered little help in determining direction. After a moment of deliberation, he decided to head in the direction he believed to be northeast, where the wagon train was going. Perhaps, with luck, he could reach a settlement before his water ran out. The next 3 days were a nightmare of heat, thirst, and hallucinations. John rationed his water strictly, allowing himself only small sips when the thirst became unbearable. At night, he partially buried himself in the sand to absorb the little moisture it retained. And during the day, he walked only in the early morning hours and late afternoon, seeking shade, when there was any, during the hottest times. His strength diminished with every hour. His lips cracked until they bled, his tongue swelled. His thoughts became confused. He began to have visions. He believed he saw shimmering lakes in the distance, only to find more sand upon approaching. He talked to people who weren't there. His father, his grandfather, Ezekiel, the villagers from the Well Village. In one of these hallucinations, he saw his field by the Mississippi, not devastated by the flood, but green and abundant. He saw himself walking among the ripe wheat, the heads brushing his waist, the setting sun turning everything into liquid gold. It was so real, so vivid, that he could smell the fertile earth, hear the whisper of the wind in the leaves, feel the texture of the grains between his fingers. For a moment, the vision seemed a cruelty, a torturous reminder of what he had lost. But gradually, something changed in his perception. It wasn't torture. It was a promise. It wasn't the past. It was the future. On the morning of the 4th day, when the water had run out and John was dragging himself more than walking, he stumbled over a small rise in the ground and rolled down a gentle slope. When he finally stopped. He found himself at the entrance of a natural cave formed by the erosion of the rocks. The interior was relatively cool, and miraculously, a small pool of water had accumulated at the bottom, the result of some occasional rain and natural condensation. With what little strength he had left, John reached the water and drank eagerly, without caring about its quality. It was liquid life, and his dehydrated body absorbed it like dry earth absorbs the first drops of rain. Then, exhausted beyond measure, he fell into a deep sleep on the rocky floor. John didn't know how long he had slept. It could have been hours or days. When he finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was a bearded face observing him. The fright made him sit up abruptly, hitting his head on the rocky wall of the cave. "Careful," said the stranger in a low, hoarse voice, as if he wasn't used to speaking. "You are weak." It was an extremely old man, with a white beard that reached almost to his waist and hair that fell in disheveled locks over his shoulders. His skin, exposed on his arms and chest visible through his torn tunic, was like sun-cured leather, marked by ancient scars. But it was his eyes that captured John's attention, a blue so pale they seemed almost transparent, and possessed of an intensity that seemed to penetrate beyond appearances. "Who are you?" John managed to ask, his voice still hoarse from dehydration. "The key." Old man smiled, revealing teeth surprisingly well preserved for someone his age. "Here in the desert, that question has little meaning. Who I am matters less than what I am. And what I am is simply a man who chose solitude to listen better." It wasn't the answer John expected, and his confusion must have been evident, for the elder laughed softly. "My name was Nathaniel, in another life. Now I am just the old man of the cave." He offered John a wooden bowl containing a dark liquid. "Drink. It's an infusion of herbs that grow in the crevices of the rocks. It will help your body regain strength." John drank cautiously. The liquid had a bitter but not unpleasant taste, and he felt a subtle energy spread through his limbs as the drink went down his throat. "How did you get here?" Nathaniel asked, sitting on a flat stone nearby. "Few find this place, even those who seek it." John told his story. The flood that destroyed his property, the wagon train, the village where they found water, the sandstorm, his expulsion, and his solitary journey through the desert. The old man listened in silence, occasionally nodding, his eyes never leaving John's face. "And now, what do you intend to do?" he asked when John finished his account. The question caught John by surprise. He had survived one day after another, without really thinking about a long-term plan. I don't know. Maybe try to reach Chicago, find work, start over." Nathaniel shook his head slowly. "Chicago is many weeks' walk from here, through the worst stretch of the desert. Without a guide, without adequate supplies, it would be suicide." The old man got up with surprising agility for his apparent age, and gestured for John to follow him further into the cave. As they went, the natural tunnel widened, opening into a spacious chamber. Beams of light entered through openings in the ceiling, illuminating what appeared to be a small improvised dwelling. A bed of straw covered with hand-woven blankets, a rudimentary table made of logs and stones, shelves carved into the rock containing bowls, tools, and parchments. In one corner, a small fire burned under a natural opening that served as a chimney. "My home for 30 years, Nathaniel explained with a sweeping gesture. "Before that, I was like you. I owned land, wealth, a respectable position, until I lost everything." "What happened?" John asked, genuinely interested. The old man's eyes became distant, as if looking at a past far beyond John's reach. "War, disease, betrayal, the usual tools of fate when it decides to turn our lives upside down." He paused, returning to the present. "But it wasn't losing everything that brought me here. It was what I found when I had nothing left." "And what did you find?" "Myself," Nathaniel replied simply. "When there are no more distractions, no possessions, no obligations, no expectations, what remains is the essence. It is painful, this encounter. Most people spend their whole lives avoiding it, but it is also liberating." Something in the hermit's words resonated deeply with John. His entire life, He had defined himself by his land, by his ability to cultivate it, by the respect it brought him in the community. Without that, who was he? In the days that followed, as John regained his strength, a peculiar relationship developed between him and Nathaniel, something between master and disciple, between father and son, between two survivors who shared an understanding that transcended words. The old man taught him how to survive in the desert, how to find water in unlikely places, how to identify edible plants that grew among the rocks, how to read the stars for guidance. More important, however, were the lessons that didn't involve practical skills, but understanding. At dusk, sitting at the entrance of the cave watching the sun paint the desert red and gold, Nathaniel shared parables and reflections accumulated over decades of contemplation. "Look at this seed," he said on one such occasion, showing John a tiny seed he had gathered from a plant growing in a rocky crevice. "It looks dead, doesn't it? Dry, hard, seemingly lifeless. Yet within it contains a perfect code, a memory of a tree, a promise of future forests. But for that promise to be realized, the seed must first be buried in darkness. It must break, disintegrate. The death of the seed is the birth of the tree." John contemplated the small seed in his palm. "Are you saying we need to be broken to grow?" The old man smiled. "I am saying that sometimes what appears to be our destruction is merely our transformation. The caterpillar doesn't die. It becomes a butterfly. Coal under immense pressure is not crushed. It turns into a diamond. But the caterpillar must first dissolve within the cocoon, and the coal must bear the weight of the mountain." Words like these, simple but profound, began to sprout in John's heart. Slowly, the sharp pain of his losses began to transform into something different. It didn't disappear, but it acquired meaning. It wasn't just suffering without purpose, but part of a larger process. A month after his arrival at the cave, on a morning when the air had a crystalline clarity that only the desert can offer, Nathaniel led John to a part of the cave he hadn't yet shown him. It was a small side chamber, lit by an opening in the ceiling. In the center, covered by an ancient faded cloth, was something that looked like a chest. The old man removed the cloth with reverence, revealing a chest of carved wood, similar to those John had seen in the wagon train. "Seeds," explained Nathaniel, opening the chest to reveal small compartments, each containing a different type of seed, the same ones your wagon train was carrying. Ezekiel isn't the first to trade them, nor will he be the last. John looked confused at the old man. How did they get here?" "I was also a merchant in another life," Nathaniel replied, with an enigmatic smile. "And these seeds have a history older than any of us. They were developed by a people who inhabited this desert millennia ago, before it became so arid. They foresaw the climate changes and created plants that could survive, even in the most adverse conditions." With delicate fingers, the old man took out a handful of seeds, small, reddish-brown, with tiny streaks on the surface. "These are particularly remarkable. They can remain dormant for decades, waiting for the right moment. When they finally find favorable conditions, even just a little moisture, they germinate with a strength that seems impossible for something so small. Their roots can penetrate compacted soil, reach water at surprising depths, extract nutrients where seemingly nothing exists." John felt a shiver run down his spine. It was as if the old man was describing not just plants, but a metaphor for human life, his life. 9 months had passed since the flood that destroyed everything he knew. 9 months of dormancy, of darkness, of apparent death. Was he like those seeds, just waiting for the right moment to germinate again? "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, his voice little more than a whisper. Nathaniel's pale eyes fixed on his. "Because it is time for you to decide if you will remain a dormant seed or if you will allow yourself to germinate. The time we spent together comes to an end." The words hit John like a physical blow. "Are you dying?" The old man laughed, a surprisingly jovial sound that echoed through the cave walls. "I have been dying since the day I was born, like all of us. But no, I am not on the verge of death. What is coming to an end is your need to stay here. You came to the cave as a broken man, almost dead. Now you are healed, not just in body, but also in spirit. It is time to carry forward what you have learned. John felt a mix of conflicting emotions: gratitude for what he had received, fear of the unknown, sadness at the imminent separation, and most surprisingly, a growing anticipation for what would come next. When he had arrived at that cave, half dead from thirst and despair, he could not have imagined that he would leave it not only recovered, but transformed. "Where will I go?" he asked, suddenly feeling like a child facing a world too big. Nathaniel placed his hands on John's shoulders, looking him directly in the eyes. "You already know the answer to that question, my son. From the moment you told me your story, there was only one possible destination for you." And John truly knew. Despite all the rational arguments against it, despite the time that had passed, despite the magnitude of the task that awaited him, there was only one place his heart called him to. "I will return to my land," he said with a conviction that surprised himself. "I will rebuild what was destroyed." The old man's smile was like the sun rising over the desert. "You will not just rebuild, but you will build something greater and better than existed before. The storm that destroyed your previous life made space for a new creation." That night, as they prepared for what would be their last meal together, Nathaniel brought John a small leather pouch. "A gift for your journey," he said, handing it to him with both hands. John opened the pouch and gasped. Inside were seeds, not just a few, but hundreds of them, of different types, including the rare red seeds the old man had shown him. "I cannot accept," he protested. "They are too valuable." Nathaniel shook his head. "Seeds do not fulfill their purpose when they remain stored in chests. They need to be planted. They need the opportunity to become what they were destined to be. In your hands, they will fulfill their destiny." John accepted the gift with tears in his eyes. It was more than a bag of seeds. It was a vote of confidence, a blessing, a commitment to the future. The next morning, exactly 1 year after the flood that had changed his fate, John departed. He carried with him not only physical supplies, water, food, the precious seeds, but also an intangible treasure of knowledge, wisdom, and renewed hope. Nathaniel guided him to the top of a dune that offered a wide view of the desert. "Follow that direction for 3 days," he instructed, pointing west. "You will find a small oasis where wagon trains stop to resupply. From there, you can find transport back to the Mississippi Valley." The two men looked at each other one last time. There was no need for long farewell speeches. Everything that needed to be said already had been throughout their conversations. With a simple embrace, they parted, the old man returning to his cave, the young man moving forward towards the horizon. The journey back was not easy. There were days when the sun seemed determined to extract every drop of moisture from his body. Nights when the biting cold turned the desert into an alien landscape. There were moments of doubt, of fear, of loneliness. But unlike the first time he had crossed those lands, John now carried within him an inner compass that always guided him back to the right path. 2 months later, after joining different wagon trains and working for passage, John finally sighted the waters of the Mississippi shimmering in the distance. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension dominating his thoughts. How would his land be? Had the flood left anything that could be saved? Or was he facing the task of rebuilding from absolute nothing? When he finally set foot on his property again, 15 months after leaving, John barely recognized it. The water had completely receded, leaving behind a transformed terrain. Where there had once been ordered fields of wheat and barley, now grew wild, disordered vegetation. The location where his house stood was partially covered by vines and thorny bushes. Nature, in its indifferent persistence, had begun to reclaim what it considered its own. But beneath the apparent chaos, John perceived something that less trained eyes would have missed: signs of extraordinary fertility. The flood, while destroying the work of generations, had deposited a new layer of nutrient-rich sediment. The plants that grew spontaneously, some of which he had never seen before, were vigorous, a deep green that spoke of healthy soil. John, spent the first few days simply observing, walking every inch of his land, relearning its contours, identifying areas where the water had carved new natural channels, places where the soil seemed especially promising. He wasn't in a hurry to cut the wild vegetation or mark boundaries. First, he needed to understand what the land had become. In the following weeks, the slow process of rebuilding began. Using the knowledge he had acquired during his journey, John didn't try to simply recreate what existed before, but designed something new. Using the irrigation parchment he had received in the well village, he drew channels that followed the natural curves of the terrain. Applying Nathaniel's lessons on planting in adverse conditions, he identified microclimates within the property where different crops could thrive. For his dwelling, he chose not to rebuild in the same location, but on a small natural rise that the flood hadn't reached. Instead of the traditional stone and mud house, he designed a circular structure partially buried in the ground for better thermal insulation, a lesson learned in the desert. The neighbors, who initially came to offer help out of pity for poor John who lost everything, began to observe his unconventional methods with growing curiosity. When they saw him deliberately planting among rubble without removing it, or creating piles of stones that seemed only to take up valuable space, many shook their heads, convinced that his time away had affected his judgment. The misfortune changed the boy, they commented among themselves. He was such a sensible farmer before. What they didn't understand was that every seemingly strange decision had a purpose. The rubble, strategically left in certain spots, served as natural windbreaks and collectors of nocturnal moisture. The piles of stones, arranged in specific patterns, created microclimates for more sensitive plants and served as habitat for small animals that helped control pests. 6 months after his return, when it was time to plant the precious seeds Nathaniel had given him, John didn't scatter them indiscriminately. Instead, following the old man's instructions, he planted them in specific places, points where they would serve as anchors for the entire ecosystem he was recreating. Some were planted near water, others in drier soil. Some in full sun, others in areas partially shaded by trees that had survived the flood. The first harvest was modest, but promising. The plants developed from the desert seeds proved their worth. They grew vigorously even in areas where the soil was still recovering, their deep roots helping to stabilize slopes and prevent erosion. More importantly, they attracted pollinators that benefited the entire property. A year after his return, what had started as a personal experiment had transformed into a living demonstration of a new way of farming. John's land didn't look like any other in the region. Instead of uniform fields of a single crop, it had diversified plots where different plants grew in symbiotic association. Instead of fighting nature, he worked with it, leveraging natural patterns, nutrient cycles, and relationships between species. The productivity per acre was impressive, in some cases higher than what he achieved before the flood. And most surprisingly, his property proved remarkably resilient to droughts and other climate extremes. While neighbors suffered from a particularly severe dry spell, his plants remained green and productive, thanks to the water harvesting system and microclimates he had created. Soon, the same neighbors who had doubted his methods began to show up with questions, initially cautious, then increasingly interested. John freely shared his knowledge, explaining not just the how, but the why of each technique. In a short time, a small community of learners formed around him, men and women, young and old, even children, all drawn by the tangible vision of abundance born from desolation. 15 months after his return, John no longer worked alone. What had begun as personal reconstruction had transformed into a community movement. Schools of sustainable agriculture emerged under his guidance, disseminating not just techniques, but a new philosophy of relationship with the land. And it was around this time that the most unexpected of visitors arrived. Ezekiel, the merchant who had expelled him in the desert. The man was visibly aged, his face more furrowed than before, his bearing less imposing. When John spotted him standing at the entrance of his property, hesitant and uncomfortable, he felt a brief pang of old resentments. quickly replaced by a serene curiosity. "Welcome to my land," he said simply, approaching with an outstretched hand. Ezekiel seemed taken aback by the reception. "You have every right to turn me away," he said, ignoring the outstretched hand. "I came to make peace, if possible. The desert taught me humility too late in life." John indicated a rustic bench under an oak tree. "Come, sit, share with me what brings you here." Sitting in the shade with a pitcher of lemonade between them, Ezekiel told his story. After the storm in the desert, the wagon train finally reached Chicago. But the damaged seeds represented a great financial loss. That was just the beginning of a series of misfortunes. Trade routes became unsafe due to tribal conflicts. Business partners betrayed his trust, and finally, already in old age, he himself fell gravely ill. "During that illness, delirious with fever, I saw your face," Ezekiel confessed. "Not as the young man I abandoned in the desert, but as you are now, serene, fulfilled. In the vision, you forgave me. When I recovered my health, I knew I needed to find you, to see if the vision could become reality." John smiled. "There is nothing to forgive, old friend. Your action, though motivated by anger, was the catalyst for my true journey. If you hadn't expelled me, I would never have found Nathaniel in the cave, never learned his lessons, never returned to turn my misfortune into a blessing." Ezekiel stared at John with astonishment. "Nathaniel? You found Nathaniel?" John nodded, surprised by the reaction. "You know him?" A hoarse laugh escaped the merchant. "Every rare seed merchant hears stories about the hermit who knows their deepest secrets. Very few find him, even fewer gain his trust." He studied John with new respect. "Now I understand how you transformed this place into the garden everyone is talking about." Before leaving, Ezekiel asked a final question. "If you could go back, prevent the flood from destroying everything, would you?" John contemplated the question for a long moment, looking around at his land, not as it had been, but as it had become. He saw the diverse and vibrant fields, the water systems working in harmony with the natural terrain, the people learning and sharing knowledge. He saw not just a prosperous farm, but a new way of life growing from the ruins of the old. "No," he finally replied. "The storm was not my enemy, but my teacher. Sometimes we need to lose everything we have to discover who we truly are. I was cast into the mud not as punishment, but as preparation. Not to define my end, but to reveal my beginning. And perhaps that is the deepest purpose of our most painful losses, to make space for a rebirth that our limited imagination could never conceive." Years passed. What had begun as a personal reconstruction project transformed into a learning center that attracted visitors from distant lands. The Farm of Awakened, Seeds, as it became known, became a symbol of resilience and innovation. John, now a mature man with silver threads in his beard, was no longer just a farmer, but a teacher, a guide, a living example of transformation. On nights of the full moon, when the starry sky evoked memories of his time in the desert, John would often sit alone by the riverbank, contemplating the path he had traveled. He remembered the desperate man who had once knelt in the mud, cursing his fate. He smiled with compassion for that younger version of himself, wishing he could tell him that what seemed like the end was just the beginning. Sometimes, when new students arrived with stories of personal losses, failed harvests, eroded lands, shattered dreams, John shared his own story, not as a recipe to be followed, but as a reminder that the seeds of renewal often hide in the soil of desolation, waiting only for the right moment to germinate. "I was cast into the mud," he would say, "not as punishment, but as preparation. Not to define my end, but to reveal my beginning. And perhaps that is the deepest purpose of our most painful losses, to make space for a rebirth that our limited imagination could never conceive."